They say grief makes people do strange things, but in that fog-covered village, people whispered about one widow who went a little further. Every night, she stepped into the mist, barefoot, silent, and fed the crows pieces of her dreams. Nobody knew what she gave them or what the birds carried back. Some say she was sending messages to her dead husband. Others say she was feeding something much older, something that waits inside the fog.
The fog rolled in thick that evening, swallowing the jagged cliffs and weather-beaten docks of Marrow Bay in a suffocating grey haze. Ellis Crane sat hunched before his radio equipment, the faint hum of electricity and the steady hiss of static, the only sounds in his cramped workshop. The room was cluttered with coils of wire, soldering tools, and a tangled maze of antennas poking out the window like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sea. Outside, the ocean's muted roar blended with the cries of distant gulls, all muffled beneath the heavy blanket of mist. Ellis rubbed his tired eyes as he adjusted the frequency dials, chasing the elusive signals that had begun to haunt his nights. For weeks he had noticed oddities in the static, a strange pattern, a rhythm that defied the usual white noise. At first, he dismissed the distortions as atmospheric interference or faulty equipment, but tonight felt different. There was a faintness to the whispering that tugged at something deep inside him, a recognition he struggled to place. A crackle interrupted the steady hiss, and a voice, barely audible, slipped through the speakers. "Ellis, Ellis." He froze, heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was fragmented, distorted, yet unmistakably calling his name. His fingers trembled as he reached to turn up the volume, eyes wide and searching the dark corners of the room as if expecting a presence beyond the glass. "Who's there?" he whispered, but the only reply was static, the voice vanishing as suddenly as it had come. Ellis leaned back, swallowing hard. Rational thought urged him to dismiss it, his mind playing tricks after long, lonely nights and too many cups of bitter coffee. But a cold knot of unease settled in his stomach. The voice was not random interference. It was something else, something personal. He glanced out the rain-speckled window, the town of Marrow Bay barely visible through the dense fog. The streets were empty, as they often were at this hour. The small fishing boats bobbed silently against the docks, their outlines ghostly in the twilight. Marrow Bay had always been a place of secrets and shadows, a town built on the edge of the sea and something far older. Returning to his equipment, Ellis began recording the static onto an old reel-to-reel tape, the reels spinning with a steady wear. He played back the recording repeatedly, focusing intently on the faint whispers buried beneath the noise. With each pass, the voice seemed to grow clearer, as if the static were a veil slowly lifting to reveal a hidden message. "Ellis, can you hear me?" The words shimmered through the speakers like a ghostly echo. A chill ran down his spine. The name was his own, spoken in a voice both haunting and familiar. Ellis's breath caught in his throat. Who or what was reaching out to him through the static sea? Hours slipped by unnoticed as Ellis sat in the dark, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across his weary face. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the coastline in silence. Inside, the radio crackled with whispers from the depths, voices tangled in waves of white noise that promised answers and something more unsettling still. Ellis's world was beginning to unravel, the boundary between signal and reality blurring with every breath. The sea was calling, and its voice was no longer content to be ignored. The rhythmic pulse of the radio filled Ellis Crane's cramped workshop, a low, constant hum interspersed with the crackle and hiss of static that seemed to thrum with a life of its own. He sat hunched over the equipment, fingers deftly adjusting dials and knobs with a practiced ease born from years of technical expertise. The faint glow from the oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers cast eerie shadows across his pale face, highlighting the dark circles beneath his eyes, a testament to nights spent chasing whispers in the static. At first, Ellis had dismissed the voices as nothing more than interference, the usual white noise that accompanied any coastal radio setup. But tonight, as the fog thickened outside and the ocean's murmur seeped into the room, the static began to fracture, splintering into fragments of sound that were unmistakably human. He paused, heart tightening, as a faint whisper drifted through the headphones, a voice, distant yet urgent, calling a name that tugged at the edges of his memory. Ellis. The sound was barely more than a breath lost amid the crackling waves of noise, but it was there, his name. The realization sent a shiver down his spine, anchoring him in a strange mixture of fascination and unease. Leaning closer, he reached for the recorder, capturing the spectral murmur with trembling hands. Over the hours that followed, Ellis immersed himself in the recordings, replaying them with meticulous care. Each segment of static held within it shards of voices, fragmented distress calls that seemed to rise from the depths beneath the waves. The messages were broken, punctuated by bursts of white noise and unintelligible syllables. Yet within the chaos, patterns emerged. His trained mind picked out recurring frequencies and modulations that hinted at a language warped by distance and distortion. Despite the technical clarity, the content remained elusive. The voices wove together cryptic phrases and shattered pleas, like echoes of lost souls trapped beneath the sea. One message spoke of cold depths and endless darkness. Another whispered warnings too faint to grasp fully. Yet, threaded through these spectral transmissions were personal touches, names, dates, fragmented memories that felt uncannily familiar. The weight of these discoveries settled heavily on Ellis. His obsession deepened as he pored over old maps, signal charts, and maritime logs, searching for any link between the voices and the history of Morro Bay. The coastal town, cloaked in fog and shadow, seemed to hold secrets as deep and inscrutable as the ocean itself. Outside his window, the world was muted by the thick blanket of fog. The distant crash of waves against jagged rocks was a constant backdrop, a reminder of the vast, unknowable sea that stretched beyond the horizon. Ellis's gaze drifted toward the water, where for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something moving beneath the surface, a dark, shifting shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. His breath caught, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Was it a trick of the light, or something more? Back in the dim glow of his workshop, the radio equipment flickered erratically, the static pulsing with an almost sentient rhythm. Ellis's fingers trembled as he adjusted the filters, isolating segments of the signal with growing urgency. One phrase emerged from the chaos, broken yet distinct, a distress call, tinged with desperation and fear. Help, beneath, do not come. The warning was both chilling and cryptic, a beacon from an unknown source that seemed to beseech him to listen, yet warn him away. Ellis felt the walls of his reality begin to shift. The voices were no longer mere technical curiosities. They were carriers of something ancient and sorrowful, reaching out through the veil of static to touch the living. Hours slipped by unnoticed as Ellis became consumed by the task. His world shrank to the confines of his workshop, the outside fading into insignificance. The steady hum of electronics was joined by whispers, sometimes overlapping, sometimes solitary, that spoke his name, recounted fragments of memories, and hinted at a presence lurking beneath the waves. At one point, a sudden flicker on the oscilloscope caught his eye. The screen wavered, distorting into a shape both vague and terrifying, a shadowy figure submerged beneath the ocean's depths, shifting and dissolving like smoke. Ellis blinked, unsure if it was a hallucination or a trick of the light. The line between signal and sea blurred, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His breaths grew shallow, heart-pounding as the voices crescendoed into a chorus of fragmented cries and whispered warnings. The isolation weighed heavily, the room closing in with the hum of the radio as his sole companion. Yet amidst the growing dread, a fierce determination burned within him. He needed to understand. He needed to know what lay beneath the static, what secrets the sea guarded so jealously. As dawn threatened the horizon, Ellis leaned back, exhaustion tugging at his limbs. The recordings filled the room, a ghostly symphony of voices from the deep. Somewhere beneath the waves, a story was unfolding, one that called to him with irresistible urgency, pulling him toward a destiny written in static and shadow. He pressed record once more, whispering into the empty room, "I'm listening." And the static answered. The heavy wooden door of the Marrow Bay Library groaned softly as Ellis Crane pushed it open, stepping inside the dim, musty sanctuary. The scent of aged paper, damp wood, and salt-laden air mingled, wrapping around him like a shroud. The quiet was profound, broken only by the faint creak of floorboards beneath his boots and the soft rustle of pages turning from somewhere deeper within the stacks. Ellis paused a moment, letting the stillness settle inside him, a fragile respite from the relentless static that haunted his waking hours. He hadn't been inside the library since moving to Marrow Bay months ago, preferring the solitude of his cluttered radio workshop. But the voices, those fractured whispers from the static sea, had grown too persistent, too insistent, pulling him beyond his machines and into the town's shadowed history. He needed context, a tether to something real. A figure emerged from between towering shelves laden with yellowed tums and brittle newspapers. Mara Voss, the town's historian and librarian, regarded him with sharp eyes that seemed to weigh the very air. She was middle-aged, with a calm demeanor that belied the weight of her knowledge. "You read the radio, man," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying an edge of wary curiosity. "I've heard about the signals." Ellis nodded, holding up his portable receiver. "They were more than interference. They were voices. Distress calls, I think, and sometimes they say my name." Mara's eyes darkened. Marrow Bay has long been a place where the sea doesn't give up its dead easily. Fishermen vanish without trace, and strange sounds are said to echo across the waves on stormy nights. They moved deeper into the stacks, Mara guiding Ellis to a secluded table where dust motes danced in the muted light of a flickering lamp. She pulled out brittle ship logs, faded newspaper clippings, and handwritten journals detailing the town's history. These records, she explained, tell stories that most prefer to forget. Men lost to the ocean, their boats found abandoned or never found at all. And always, the sea whispers something strange. Ellis traced a finger along a yellowed page describing a night decades ago, when a fishing vessel's radio had crackled with fragmented voices before it disappeared. "Sounds a lot like what I'm hearing," he murmured. As rain began to tap rhythmically against the library's ancient windows, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening like dark fingers stretching across the floor. Mara's words wove a tapestry of melancholy and warning, her voice a tether pulling Ellis back from the edge of his spiraling obsession. "You must be careful," she said softly. "The sea doesn't just take. Sometimes it calls, and those who answer, they don't always come back the same." Suddenly, a faint murmur flickered from Ellis's radio, resting on the table beside him. The static shimmered and parted for a moment, revealing a fragmented voice, indistinct yet unmistakably human. The hairs on Ellis's arms prickled as the chilling reminder of the unknown echoed through the quiet room. Mara glanced at the device, her expression unreadable. "It's not just your mind, Ellis, something's reaching out." The uneasy alliance forged in that quiet library room gave Ellis a fragile hope, a fragile link to reality. Yet as the night deepened and the rain intensified, the voices in the static seemed to grow louder, more urgent. And with every whispered word, Ellis felt the boundary between the town's dark past and his own unraveling grip on sanity blur further. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the distant sound of crashing waves and the faint, sorrowful calls from beneath the static sea. And somewhere in the depths, the ocean waited, patient and eternal. The static had shifted again. It was no longer the mindless white noise that had filled Ellis Crane's nights since he'd arrived in Marrow Bay. Now, within the crackling hiss, fragments of words emerged, broken, elusive, but unmistakably coherent. Sitting alone in the dim glow of his cluttered workshop, Ellis's gaze was fixed on the radio's flickering dials. The air was thick with the scent of aged electronics and sea salt that crept in through the cracked window. He leaned closer, heart pounding, as a voice slipped through the static. It was fractured, like a message scrambled across decades, but it called his name. Ellis. Ellis. A shiver ran down his spine. The voice was familiar, yet alien, distorted by waves of interference, but clear enough to anchor him to the sinister reality of the signals. He fumbled with the knobs, trying to stabilize the frequency, desperate to catch more of the message. The voice dissolved into white noise, then returned, this time with a sentence that was almost a warning. Do not listen too long. The sea remembers. Ellis's breath hitched. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was interference, a trick of the equipment or his own fraying sanity. But another part, darker, more vulnerable, clung to the possibility that these voices were real, that they were reaching out to him with purpose. Days blurred together as Ellis obsessed over the recordings. He spent hours isolating fragments of the transmissions, replaying them over and over. Sometimes the voices took on a haunting quality, morphing into a timbre that struck a buried chord within him, a voice that sounded like Lena, his lost sister. Her disappearance had always been an open wound, a mystery wrapped in silence and sorrow. Now, that voice was bleeding through the static, ambiguous and beckoning. One night, as the coastal fog thickened outside, Ellis sat hunched over his equipment. The radio crackled with a sequence of sounds that seemed almost musical, a pattern beneath the chaos. Then, unmistakably, he heard it. Lena, come home. His hands trembled. Was it a hallucination, a trick of his desperate mind? Or was it truly her, reaching out from somewhere beneath the waves, trapped in the same corrupted signals that haunted him? The boundaries between past and present, memory and signal, began to blur. Ellis found himself unable to distinguish the voices in the static from his own thoughts. Faces from his childhood, fragments of conversations, and spectral echoes of the ocean merged into a tapestry of fractured reality. His isolation deepened. He stopped answering calls from Mara Voss and ignored the concerned warnings of Captain Jonas Reed. The voices had become a relentless tide, pulling him deeper into obsession. He talked aloud to the unseen presences in his workshop, weaving desperate questions into the static. Who are you? What do you want? The radio responded with a chorus of fragmented replies, some pleading, others ominous. Warnings of storms yet to come, of a presence beneath the sea that waited, patient and eternal. Ellis's nights became haunted by a cacophony of whispers, voices overlapping and warping, as if the ocean itself was speaking through the corrupted signals. In rare moments of clarity, Ellis recorded these transmissions meticulously, hoping to decipher their meaning. His fingers were raw from rewinding tapes, his eyes bloodshot from staring at waveforms that promised answers just beyond reach. Each clue seemed to pull him closer to a truth he was terrified to face. Yet, with every revelation, his grip on reality loosened. The voices teased him with memories that were not entirely his own, shadows of ancient sorrows intertwined with his personal loss. The radio became a conduit not only to the unknown but to the fractured recesses of Ellis's mind. One evening, as the waves crashed with a fury outside his window, Ellis's resolve snapped. He whispered into the static, "If you are real, show me." The response was immediate, a surge of static that coalesced into a voice both familiar and alien, a voice that carried the weight of the abyss. We are here. Beneath. Always beneath, the line between signal and sea, between memory and madness, had begun to dissolve. Ellis's journey into the fractured signals was no longer just a quest for truth. It was a descent into the dark heart of the static sea itself. And as the voices grew louder, more insistent, Ellis knew he could never turn away. The sky darkened quickly over Marrow Bay, a heavy curtain of grey rolling in from the sea with a low, ominous rumble in its wake. Ellis Crane stood in his cramped radio room, the cold bite of the approaching storm seeping through the cracked window frame. The air thickened with humidity and the faint, metallic scent of salt spray. His gaze was locked on the tangled mess of wires and dials before him, the radio humming softly in the background, a steady pulse beneath the rising storm. The first drops of rain tapped irregular rhythms against the glass, each one a sharp counterpoint to the low static that filled the room. For hours, Ellis had been obsessively tuning and retuning the frequencies, chasing fragments of voices that danced just beyond clarity. Tonight, the static was different, alive, almost sentient. As the wind howled outside, the radio's crackle shifted, voices emerging like distant echoes from beneath the waves. At first, they were fragmented, unintelligible whispers buried beneath layers of white noise. Then, unmistakably, a voice pierced through the interference, a faint but clear call of his name, Ellis. Ellis. The words twisted through the static, pulling him from the edge of sleep and dragging him back into a waking nightmare. He reached out, fingers trembling, adjusting the frequency with meticulous care, desperate to catch more. The voices swelled with the rising storm, merging with the rhythmic pounding of rain and the relentless crash of distant waves. The room flickered with the glow of the radio dials, casting jittery shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The merging sounds created a haunting symphony, an eerie, otherworldly chorus that blurred the lines between signal and sound, between reality and hallucination. Hours passed unnoticed. The storm outside grew violent, wind tearing at the wooden frame of his house, rain lashing the windows with increasing ferocity. Ellis barely registered the chill running down his spine as the voices grew more insistent, weaving cryptic messages and fragmented memories into the static. At times, they sounded like the voice of his sister Lena, soft, pleading, lost in the depths of the oceanic white noise. A sudden knock on the door startled him. The shrill sound cut through the oppressive atmosphere, sharp and unwelcome. Ellis hesitated, then rose to answer. Standing on the threshold was Captain Jonas Reed, the retired fisherman, his face weather-beaten and grim, eyes like storm clouds themselves. "You shouldn't be out here tonight," Reed said, voice rough as sea gravel. "Storm's coming in bad. But that's not all you should worry about." Ellis frowned, stepping aside to let the man in. "I'm fine, just caught up in the signals." Reed's gaze swept the room, taking in the cluttered radio equipment and the flickering dials. "You chasing ghosts, Ellis. The sea's got a way of twisting minds, especially when you listen too close." "It's not ghosts," Ellis insisted, though the doubt flickered in his eyes. "There's something there, something beneath the waves." The old fisherman shook his head slowly, a look of weary sorrow crossing his face. "I lost men to that something. Strange disappearances, voices on the wind, shadows in the water. It's an old curse, one that's swallowed more than a few here. You do best to leave it be." But Ellis's obsession would not be deterred. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within him, a chaotic tempest of fear and fascination. He returned to his radio, tuning in once more, desperate to decipher the growing surge of corrupted signals. The voices rose in a crescendo, blending with the roaring sea and the crackle of static into a terrifying harmony. And then, amid the chaos, came the unmistakable sound of Lena's voice, soft, distant, calling out to him from the depths, a haunting thread weaving together memory and madness. Ellis's hands clenched around the radio, knuckles white, as the storm raged on, both outside and within. The boundary between signal and sea, between the voices and the waves, began to dissolve, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The storm on the horizon was not just a gathering of weather, it was a harbinger of the unraveling that awaited. And Ellis Crane was caught in its unforgiving embrace, teetering on the edge of a dark and endless unknown. As lightning split the sky and thunder rolled like the roar of ancient leviathans, Ellis whispered into the static, "I'm coming." And the sea answered. The salty tang of the sea air clung to Ellis Crane's clothes as he settled into the cramped back room of Marrow Bay's library, where the faint hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the creaking of ancient wooden shelves. The room was a vault of forgotten memories, dusty and dim, filled with brittle ship logs and yellowed newspapers that whispered secrets long buried by time. Ellis's fingers trembled slightly as he carefully unfolded a fragile ledger, the pages crackling like dry leaves under his touch. His eyes scanned the faded ink, tracing names and dates that seemed to pulse with a strange resonance in his mind. The voices in the static had driven him here, pulling him deeper into a labyrinth of history and half-truths. At first, they had been mere fragments, ghostly echoes lost in the white noise of his radio equipment. But now their urgency was unmistakable, a spectral call that transcended decades. Each entry in the ship logs spoke of fishermen and sailors who vanished without trace, swallowed by the ocean's indifferent maw. What unsettled Ellis most was the pattern emerging from these records, strange disturbances in radio frequencies coinciding with every disappearance. He leaned closer, the flickering light overhead casting long shadows that danced across the walls like phantoms. The names Harland, McCarthy, Jensen were more than mere ink on paper. They were voices trapped beneath the waves, bound to the static that haunted his nights. Ellis's breath hitched as he uncovered a faded newspaper clipping detailing a violent storm that had ravaged the coast nearly 50 years ago. The article mentioned distorted radio chatter picked up by local operators, disturbing, indecipherable signals that had driven a young technician to madness. Ellis's heart pounded. The abyssal voice was no recent menace. It had been reaching out for generations. His mind spun with the implications. The entity beneath the sea was not just a myth or a trick of the mind. It was a persistent force, feeding on loss and obsession. He thought of Lena, his sister, her voice occasionally threading through the static like a fragile lifeline. Was she among the lost souls claimed by this ancient presence? The question gnawed at him, fueling a hunger for answers that left little room for rest or reason. Days blurred into nights as Ellis withdrew into his workshop, a sanctuary cluttered with tangled wires, oscilloscopes, and flickering monitors. The air was thick with the scent of solder and stale coffee, and the only sound was the ceaseless murmur of static crackling through his speakers. He had become a ghost himself, pale, gaunt, eyes rimmed with exhaustion yet burning with feverish intensity. He replayed corrupted audio files, isolating patterns and frequencies, chasing whispers that dissolved as soon as he tried to grasp them. On one particularly bleak afternoon, a sharp knock startled him. Mara Voss stood at the threshold, her sharp eyes softening with concern. "Ellis," she said quietly, "you can't keep going like this. The town's history is dark, yes, but some truths are meant to remain buried." He barely looked up, his voice a brittle whisper. "The voices, they were real. They were trying to tell me something." Mara's gaze flickered to the radio equipment, where a low static hiss filled the silence, a spectral undercurrent that seemed to pulse with unspoken menace. "Be careful," she warned. "The sea doesn't give up its secrets easily, and sometimes it takes more than you were willing to lose." The warning hung in the air as Mara left, leaving Ellis alone with the creeping dread that the abyssal voice was tightening its grip. That evening he walked to the shore, the sky a bruised canvas of twilight. The waves churned restlessly, and beneath the surface, a faint, eerie glow shimmered like a beacon from another world. The hum that rose from the depths vibrated through his bones, a haunting melody that called to something buried deep within him. Ellis felt the boundary between reality and nightmare blur. The spectral sea whispered promises and threats, a communion of ancient rage and sorrow intertwined with his own fractured memories. He knew that his descent had only just begun, that to understand the abyssal voice meant risking everything he was, everything he had left. As the tide drew back, leaving behind trembling shells and salt-stung sand, Ellis turned away from the shore with a resolve hardened by fear and obsession. The path beneath the surface was dark, tangled with shadows and whispers, but it was the only way forward. The abyssal voice awaited, and Ellis Crane was ready to answer its call. The room was thick with the hum of old radio equipment, the steady static filling the silence like a living thing. Ellis Crane sat hunched over his console, eyes bloodshot and wide. fingers twitching over the dials as if they could somehow wrest control from the chaotic noise that poured through the speakers. The air was damp, carrying the faint, briny scent of the nearby ocean that seeped through the cracked window pane. Outside, the waves thrashed against the rocky shore, their relentless rhythm a mournful drumbeat beneath the crashing storm. His breath came shallow, uneven, as the static began to warp and twist, warping into something more sinister, more deliberate. It was then that the voice came faint at first, a whisper lost in the white noise. Ellis, Ellis. It murmured, a sound both intimate and alien, as though the ocean itself had learned his name and was calling him home. His heart pounded, a wild drum echoing against the walls of his skull. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing, searching the shifting patterns of sound for meaning. The voice grew clearer, fragmented words surfacing like sunken wreckage. Help me, beneath the waves. Don't forget. Lena. The name ripped through him. Lena, his sister. Lost to the sea years ago, her disappearance a shadow that haunted his every waking moment. The connection was undeniable, or was it? Was this the abyssal voice reaching through the static, entwining itself with his memories, or was his own mind splintering under the strain of isolation and obsession? He closed his eyes, and the room dissolved. He stood on a shore bathed in moonlight, the ocean stretching before him, dark and infinite. From the depths, shadowy figures emerged, their forms flickering like phantoms caught between worlds. Faces blurred and twisted in the rolling swell, their mouths opening in silent screams that seemed to seep into his bones. The abyssal voice sang through them, a song of ancient rage and sorrow, a lament for lost souls dragged beneath the waves. Ellis's breath caught in his throat. The voices were no longer confined to the radio. They had become part of the sea itself, a chorus of despair that called to him with irresistible force. He reached out, trembling as spectral hands seemed to brush his own, cold and wet as the ocean's spray. The line between hallucination and reality blurred. Was this a vision, or had he truly crossed into the abyssal realm where the abyssal voice dwelled? Snapping back to the present, Ellis stumbled to his equipment, fingers fumbling to record the transmissions. Each click and whir of the tape recorder was a desperate attempt to capture the intangible, to hold on to something real amidst the encroaching madness. Yet the recordings only deepened the mystery layered with static, voices overlapped and intertwined. Lena's pleading blending seamlessly with the abyssal voice's mournful cries. Through the haze of obsession, a single thought crystallized. The voices were not just echoes of the past, but a living presence reaching out to him, beckoning him closer to the depths. And with every passing moment, Ellis felt himself slipping further, pulled inexorably toward the sea's cold embrace. Outside, the storm raged on, a symphony of fury and despair that matched the tempest within his mind. The static crackled louder, the voices growing more insistent, and Ellis knew the abyss was calling, and he would answer. But what awaited him beneath the waves was no longer just a mystery of lost sailors or fractured memories. It was something older, darker, a presence shaped by the sorrow of drowned souls and the corruption of forgotten signals. A force that threatened to consume everything Ellis held dear, including his sanity. As the night deepened, so too did Ellis's descent, his fragile grip on reality slipping like sand through his fingers. The abyssal voice whispered promises and threats, its spectral song weaving around his thoughts, ensnaring him in a web of obsession and despair. And in the heart of the static sea, Ellis stood on the threshold of a terrifying revelation, a silent scream beneath the waves that would change him forever. The voices swirled, a tempest of sound and meaning, and Ellis reached out once more, ready to embrace the darkness. The abyss was waiting. The room was dim, the thin light from the street lamp outside filtering through the half-closed blinds and casting long, slanting shadows across the floor. Ellis Crane sat rigidly in the worn leather chair, his fingers nervously tracing the seam of the armrest. Across from him, Felix Harrow watched with a measured gaze, eyes calm but alert to the tension radiating from his patient. Ellis, Harrow began gently, I know these voices feel real to you, but they, fragments, perhaps echoes of your mind, distorted by stress and isolation. Ellis's eyes flickered, dark and haunted. They were not just echoes, he whispered, voice tight. They speak to me. They know my name. Lena's voice, she calls to me through the static. It's her, I'm sure of it. Harrow shifted, leaning forward. You've told me before about your sister's disappearance. The loss has clearly affected you deeply. But these voices, have you considered that they might be symptoms of something else? That the static is a projection of your grief and obsession? A bitter laugh escaped Ellis. Obsession. Yes, maybe, but it's more than grief. There's something beneath the waves, something ancient and terrible. It's reaching out, trying to reclaim what it lost. And I'm the only one who can hear it. The psychologist sighed, a mixture of concern and frustration tightening his features. Ellis, you re-isolating yourself, chasing signals that only bring you pain. Your mental state is fragile. We need to find a way to ground you back in reality. Ellis's gaze hardened, the pale skin of his face almost translucent under the flickering fluorescent light. If I stop listening, if I turn away, I lose more than the voices. I lose myself. I can't leave them behind, not yet. Harrow reached out, placing a steady hand on Ellis's arm. You don't have to face this alone. Let me help you. But Ellis pulled away, retreating into the shadows of his own mind. No one else can hear them. No one else understands. It's my burden. As the session ended, Ellis walked out into the chill, fog-laden night of Marrow Bay. The streets were empty, and the ocean's distant roar mingled with the faint crackle of static from his portable radio. He clutched it tightly, the device a lifeline to the voices that haunted him. Through the haze, he glimpsed a shadow beneath the water's surface, a flicker of movement, too quick to be real, yet impossible to ignore. Back in his cluttered workshop, surrounded by tangled wires and humming equipment, Ellis played back the recordings again and again, each distorted whisper gnawing at his sanity. The line between memory and madness blurred further with every passing hour. Lena's voice, sweet and sorrowful, beckoned from the depths, intertwined with the dark lament of the abyssal presence that had claimed so many before him. The radio crackled violently, sending a surge of static crashing through the room. Ellis's breath caught in his throat as a chilling phrase emerged from the noise, his name, clear and insistent, followed by a warning he could not decipher. His hands shook, but he pressed record, desperate to capture every fragment, every fleeting sound. Days passed in a fugue of obsession. Harrow's calls went unanswered. Mara's concerned messages remained unopened. Even Captain Jonas Reed's warnings seemed to fade into the background of Ellis's unraveling world. One evening, as the fog thickened and the ocean's voice rose in a mournful chorus, Ellis sat hunched over his equipment. The boundary between the physical and the spectral thinned, and he felt the abyssal voice brush against his mind like cold water slinking beneath the skin. In a rare moment of clarity, he whispered to the empty room, I'm not afraid. Not yet. But the shadows behind his eyes deepened, and the static swelled, promising that the abyss was patient and eternal. Ellis sat hunched over his radio console, the dim glow of dials and meters casting long shadows across the cramped room. Outside, the coastal fog clung like a shroud to Marrow Bay, muffling the distant crash of waves against jagged rocks. The static had become a constant companion, a white noise tapestry embroidered with fleeting whispers and fractured syllables. Tonight, however, something was different. He replayed the latest recording, fingers trembling as the familiar hiss of static gave way to a sequence of distorted voices. At first, it was unintelligible, but then, beneath the static's roar, a pattern emerged, a cadence almost like a chant, rhythmic and hypnotic. Ellis leaned closer, straining to catch the words. The tide, the call, beneath the bone, the phrase repeated, fragments drifting in and out of clarity. His heart quickened. Was it a message, a warning, or a lure? The radio crackled again, and the voices swirled into a mosaic of sounds, some familiar, others alien. For a fleeting moment, A voice, soft and trembling, whispered his name. Ellis's breath caught. He wiped sweat from his brow, mind racing to piece together the puzzle. This was no mere interference. The signals were layered, encoded with meaning that transcended static noise. Time and again, he isolated fragments, snatches of forgotten memories, calls for help, cryptic warnings entwined with his own past. Days earlier, Mara Voss had expressed concern over his growing obsession. He remembered their last meeting at the library, the scent of old parchment and sea salt thick in the air. Mara, ever pragmatic, had urged caution. "Ellis," she had said gently, "there are stories in Marrow Bay that echo what you're rehearing. But some things are meant to stay buried beneath the waves." He had barely acknowledged her warning, distracted by the relentless pull of the voices. Still, Mara's research had proven invaluable. Together, they'd uncovered records of vanished fishermen, tragic shipwrecks, and unexplained disappearances, threads woven into the town's dark tapestry. Yet their alliance was fraying. Mara's concern bordered on frustration as Ellis withdrew further into his solitary world. His responses grew curt. His eyes glazed with the weight of unspoken terrors. Captain Jonas Reed had been more direct. The gruff, weather-beaten man met Ellis on the pier just before dusk, the sea wind tugging at his heavy coat. "You're chasing ghosts," Reed warned, voice rough as gravel. "The ocean doesn't forgive curiosity. It takes what it wants, and it don't care if you were ready or not." Ellis merely nodded, his mind already elsewhere. Now, confronted with this cryptic chant, he felt the pull of something ancient and unfathomable. The voices were no longer just echoes. They were a summons. As the hours wore on, Ellis's fixation deepened. He scoured old ship logs and town archives by day, piecing together a ritual hinted at in fragmented maritime folklore, a convergence of tides. A moment when the sea's boundary thinned, and the abyssal voice might reveal itself. At night, he returned to his radio, chasing the elusive signals with a scientist's precision and an addict's desperation. The static became a living thing, breathing secrets and sorrow into his ears. One evening, as a storm brewed on the horizon, the radio flared with a sudden intensity. The room filled with a spectral chorus, voices overlapping in a cacophony that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Ellis's hands trembled as he adjusted the dials, trying to isolate the source. Within the chaos, a single phrase emerged clearly, repeated with relentless urgency. "Come to the edge. The tide calls." His skin prickled with cold anticipation. The edge was at the shoreline, the boundary between the known and the abyss. Mara's face flashed in his memory, her worried eyes pleading for him to turn away. Captain Reed's warning echoed in his ears, but the call was irresistible. The next morning, Ellis declined Mara's invitation to meet, and he brushed off Reed's caution like a distant echo. His world had narrowed to the signal, the message pulsating beneath the waves, beckoning him toward a fate he could neither predict nor resist. As twilight blurred into night, Ellis prepared his equipment. The ritual hinted at in the voices the convergence of tides and signals was imminent. He packed transmitters, receivers, and recording devices, determined to capture and confront whatever lay beneath the surface. Outside, the wind whispered through the coastal pines, and the sea churned restlessly. The boundary between signal and reality thinned, and Ellis stood at the cusp of obsession and revelation. In that moment, Marrow Bay held its breath, the static sea waiting to claim its due. The voices were calling, and Ellis was ready to answer. The room was thick with the cold, salty air that crept in through the cracked window, mingling with the faint hum of electricity and the ceaseless, restless static pouring from the speakers of Ellis Crane's radio equipment. Night had deepened into a heavy, suffocating darkness, broken only by the soft, flickering glow of the dials and meters scattered across his cluttered desk. Ellis sat hunched, his slender fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the controls, eyes fixed on the wavering patterns dancing across the oscilloscopes. He had been at it for hours, chasing the elusive fragments of sound that had begun to haunt his nights with unnerving clarity. At first, They had been indecipherable, mere ghostly murmurs buried within the white noise. But tonight, as the wind howled against the walls of his small coastal shack and the waves crashed relentlessly against the cliffs outside, something shifted. Through the crackle and hiss, a voice emerged, soft, trembling, almost impossibly familiar. Ellis. The single word pierced the static like a fragile beacon in the void. His breath caught, heart hammering as he leaned closer to the speaker, straining to hear again. Another whisper, this time clearer, more insistent. Ellis, don't forget me. His eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief warring with a surge of aching hope. The voice was unmistakable. Lena, his sister. Gone these many years, swallowed by the sea's shadowed depths and the silence that had followed her disappearance. The sound was fragile, like a fragile thread of memory stretched across the abyss of time and loss. Ellis's mind reeled, memories flooding back, unbidden childhood afternoons spent on the rocky shores of Marrow Bay, the salty spray on their faces, her laughter mingling with the call of gulls and the crash of waves. He could almost see her there, sun-bleached hair tangled by the wind, bright eyes full of mischief and promise. How many times had he replayed those moments in his mind, desperate to hold on to what had been lost? Yet now, something darker lurked beneath these echoes. The voice was not simply a message from the past. It was entwined with shadows, warped by the same static that carried the abyssal voice's corrupted signals. The boundary between memory and nightmare blurred, and Ellis felt the weight of an unseen presence pressing closer. Hands shaking, he reached for his recorder, fingers fumbling as he tried to capture every fragment of the spectral message. The room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the air thickening as the voices layered one over another, his sister's plaintive calls weaving with distorted warnings, a chorus of despair and ancient sorrow. Remember, the depths, the call. The words slithered through the static like serpents, curling around Ellis's thoughts, pulling him deeper into their tangled web. He felt his sanity fray, the walls between reality and hallucination dissolving as the radio became a vessel for something otherworldly. Suddenly, a sharp crackle cut through the speakers, and the lights flickered violently. Shadows stretched and twisted across the room, taking on the shape of watery tendrils reaching out from the abyss itself. Ellis's breath hitched, heart pounding as the spectral presence seemed to press against his very soul. Ellis, the voice whispered again, now a chilling merge of Lena and the abyssal voice, come to us beneath the waves, where all is lost and found. Panic surged through him, but so did an unbearable yearning, a need to understand, to connect, to rescue whatever remained of his sister and himself from the consuming darkness. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white, as the room spun and the sea's eternal call echoed through his mind. Was it truly Lena reaching out? Or was this a cruel deception, a siren's lure spun by the abyssal entity to ensnare another lost soul? The question burned in Ellis's mind, but the answer felt just beyond reach, swallowed by the endless static and the vast, unknowable ocean. The night wore on, and Ellis sat alone, trapped between worlds, the voices rising and falling like the tide whispering secrets, beckoning him toward a fate intertwined with the dark sea. As the first light of dawn crept hesitantly through the window, the radio crackled once more, and the faintest echo of Lena's voice faded into the static, leaving behind a silence heavy with dread and desperate hope. And somewhere in the depths, the abyss waited, patient and eternal. Ellis Crane sat hunched over the cluttered workbench in his cramped workshop, the low hum of electrical currents a constant companion. The room was lit only by the pale green glow of indicator lights blinking rhythmically on his array of radio receivers and frequency analyzers. Around him, coils of wire, soldering irons, and patch cables lay scattered, a testament to the relentless hours he had poured into tuning his equipment for a single purpose: to listen. The static that filled the speakers was no longer mere background noise. It had become a symphony of fractured voices and elusive signals that seemed to reach out from the depths below the waves. Earlier, Ellis had dismissed the strange bursts as atmospheric interference, but now they carried something unmistakably human: fragments of speech, whispered names, and occasionally a direct address that sent a shiver crawling down his spine. Ellis. The voice was faint, layered beneath the crackle of static, yet clear enough to stop his breath. He leaned closer, adjusting the frequency dial with trembling fingers. The voices grew more insistent, overlapping and warping like a chorus of drowned souls pleading to be heard. The signals twisted and turned in ways that defied conventional radio physics, as if the sea itself was bending the waves to send a message meant only for him. Despite the growing unease gnawing at his mind, Ellis's obsession deepened. He knew he was teetering on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a boundary where scientific rationality gave way to something darker and more primal. But he could not turn away, not now. The next morning, seeking context for the voices and their cryptic content, Ellis made his way to the Marrow Bay Library. The building was an aging structure of weathered stone and salt-stained windows, its interior steeped in the scent of old paper and sea brine. Here Mara Voss awaited him, a calm, pragmatic historian with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You read Chasing Ghosts, Ellis," she said quietly, her voice steady but edged with concern as she guided him through dusty stacks of ship logs, newspaper clippings, and town records. "Not ghosts. Signals," Ellis insisted, his gaze fierce. "Voices from beneath the waves, they were real." Mara studied the faded documents, pointing out patterns of disappearances and strange occurrences around Marrow Bay. Fishermen lost without a trace, vessels found adrift with no crew aboard, and radio operators who reported hearing voices in the static before vanishing. The town's history was a tapestry woven with mystery, one that seemed to echo the messages Ellis intercepted. "The sea holds its secrets tightly," Mara murmured, "but sometimes it leaves breadcrumbs." Buoyed by Mara's insights, Ellis returned to his workshop with renewed purpose. His fingers danced over knobs and switches, fine-tuning the receivers to pick up the faintest distortions that might reveal more about the entity behind the voices. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellis met with Captain Jonas Reed on the jagged shoreline. The retired fisherman's face was creased by years of salt and wind, his eyes sharp with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had seen the ocean's darker side. "You're meddling with things better left alone, Crane," Jonas warned, his voice rough like gravel. "The sea's got a hunger, and it don't forget." Ellis met the captain's gaze steadily. "I need to know what's out there." "What's calling me?" Jonas shook his head slowly. "Some calls ain't meant to be answered. They pull you under, body and soul." But Ellis was already too far gone to heed caution. That night, back in his workshop, the voices on the radio swelled into a tumultuous crescendo. The static became a living tide of sound, waves crashing and voices melding into a chorus that was at once terrifying and hypnotic. Amid the chaotic noise, a single phrase pierced through with chilling clarity: "Come to us, Ellis. The water waits." The room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, the boundary between signal and sea dissolving as Ellis stared into the glowing screens. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. The abyss was calling, and he was ready to cross the threshold. As the night deepened, Ellis began assembling gear for the journey ahead: signal boosters, recording devices, and a carefully annotated map of the bay's most treacherous waters. Every choice he made was deliberate, a step closer to the encounter that would define his fate. Yet, beneath the resolve lay a simmering doubt. Was this path one of discovery or damnation? Could he hold on to himself when the voices grew louder, promising secrets that might unravel the very fabric of his mind? The signals continued to pulse, urgent and alive, as if the entity beneath the waves was not merely reaching out but beckoning him to join the endless chorus of the static sea. Ellis Crane stood at the edge of understanding and madness, ready to cross into the dark unknown. The radio crackled once more, and the voices whispered his name again, fading into the eternal roar of the ocean. "Ellis." The journey was only beginning. The storm had come on faster than anyone in Marrow Bay had expected. Dark clouds rolled in from the sea, swallowing the horizon in a thick smear of grey that churned with a wild, unrelenting fury. Rain lashed against the windows of Ellis Crane's small coastal home, the wind howling like an ancient beast through the creaking eaves. Inside, Ellis sat hunched over his radio equipment, his eyes glazed and fixed on the crackling static that filled the speakers with its ceaseless hiss. For days, the voices had grown louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of the static like threads of ghostly silk. Tonight, though, there was something different, a pulse beneath the noise, a rhythm that seemed to beat in time with the thunder outside. It was as though the storm itself had become a conduit and amplifier for the spectral signals that had haunted Ellis since he first heard them. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the dials, seeking to isolate the source amid the chaos. And then, through the white noise, a voice emerged, soft, fractured, but unmistakably calling his name. Ellis. Ellis. The room felt suddenly colder, the shadows deepening as the voice wove around him like a living thing. The radio's static surged, warping into a tapestry of whispers and cries that echoed with sorrow and rage. Ellis swallowed hard, an unbidden shiver running down his spine. He knew what he had to do. Clutching the portable receiver, he stepped outside into the storm's embrace. The wind tore at his thin jacket, rain stinging his face as he made his way toward the jagged cliffs overlooking the roiling sea. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the tumultuous waves that crashed against the rocks below with a sound like the world's own anguished scream. As Ellis approached the shoreline, the radio's static grew more volatile, voices layering over one another in a discordant symphony. Shapes flickered in the spray, shadowy figures rising and falling with the swell. Half-seen specters that seemed to pulse with the corrupted signals seeping from the ocean's depths. His heart pounded as the voices coalesced into a chorus, their tones weaving between the familiar and the alien. "Come to us! Come back!" They urged, an invitation and a warning intertwined. The abyssal voice was no longer a distant whisper. It was here, tangible and terrifying. Ellis stood at the water's edge, rain soaking through his clothes, the cold biting into his skin. The spectral figures drew closer, their forms shimmering with the flickering interference of the storm's electromagnetic fury. In the midst of the cacophony, a solitary voice broke free, soft, trembling, achingly familiar. Lena, the sound was a knife to his heart. Memories surged unbidden, laughter on sunlit beaches, the warmth of a sister's embrace, then the cold silence of her disappearance. Yet here she was, caught in the abyssal chorus, a fragment of memory twisted by the sea's dark will. "Ellis," the voice whispered, fragile as a breath, "don't come." The warning clashed with the pull of the other voices, and Ellis faltered, torn between the desire to reach her and the dread of what lay beneath the waves. The storm raged around him, the boundary between signal and sea dissolving into a spectral tempest where reality and nightmare entwined. In that moment, Ellis knew his choice would define him. To surrender to the abyss meant losing himself to the corrupted signals, becoming yet another voice trapped in the static sea. To resist was to fight an unknowable force that threatened to unravel his very mind. His breath ragged, he tightened his grip on the radio, the static crescendoing into a deafening roar that threatened to swallow him whole. Lightning cracked overhead, momentarily blinding him, and when his vision cleared, the spectral figures had receded into the depths, leaving only the endless, haunting static. Ellis sank to his knees on the wet rocks, the storm's fury washing over him as a fragile hope flickered within the storm-dark night. The voices had called him here, but whether he had answered correctly was a question that would haunt the silence after the storm's embrace. The night had fallen heavy and oppressive over Marrow Bay, the sky a roiling mass of slate-gray clouds torn apart by fierce winds. Ellis stood at the jagged edge of the shoreline, his coat soaked through, the cold rain mingling with the sea spray that stung his face. The radio equipment lay abandoned in the shack behind him. Here, at the boundary between land and the endless, unknowable ocean, the voices had drawn him. They called to him no longer distant whispers trapped in static, but a torrent of sound that crashed into his mind like the waves breaking upon the rocks. He raised his arms as if to embrace the storm itself, and the static around him seemed to pulse, a living entity breathing in time with the ocean's fury. The abyssal voice, the spectral presence lurking beneath the waves for so long, was no longer a hidden murmur. It was a tempest of corrupted signals, a chorus of drowned memories and alien sorrow, reaching out with tendrils of sound and shadow. The voices swirled around Ellis, calling his name, weaving fragments of Lena's voice with the cries of lost fishermen and the low hum of the deep sea. The world shifted and twisted. One moment he was standing on the wet rocks, the wind tearing at his clothes. The next he was submerged beneath dark waters, surrounded by shifting forms that shimmered just beyond clear sight. Faces emerged from the depths, some familiar, others grotesquely warped, each locked in eternal silence beneath the crushing pressure of the sea. Their eyes, pools of abyssal black, seemed to plead and warn him, their murmurs tangled with the static that filled his ears. Ellis's breath came in ragged gasps as he sank deeper into this nightmare vision, the boundaries between memory and madness dissolving like salt in storm-tossed waves. Lena's laughter echoed faintly, fragile and broken, as he felt the icy fingers of the abyssal voice brush against his thoughts. It was a presence both ancient and sorrowful, a consciousness born from drowned souls and forgotten tragedies, longing to reclaim what was lost. Its voice was a tangled web of rage and lament, promising unity beneath the crushing weight of the ocean. Desperation surged through Ellis. He clenched his fists, forcing himself back toward the surface of reality. No, he whispered fiercely, I am not yours. I am not lost. The storm intensified as if in response, waves crashing higher, wind howling through the jagged cliffs. The static reached a fever pitch, a maddening symphony of voices, some pleading, others threatening, all vying for his attention. Yet in the chaos, Ellis found a sliver of clarity, a fragile anchor in the tempest. He shouted into the night, his voice raw and trembling, I remember! I remember Lena! I remember who I am! For a fleeting moment, the voices faltered, the storm paused, and the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The abyss lurked just beneath the surface still, but Ellis stood resolute, a solitary figure defying the depths. Yet the cost was clear. The assault had left scars etched into his mind, fractures that whispered of futures uncertain. As the first pale light of dawn broke through the clouds, Ellis stumbled back from the shore, soaked and shivering, his eyes haunted but defiant. The abyssal voice had not claimed him yet, but the boundary between man and unknown remained perilously thin. The radio's ceaseless static echoed faintly in his ears, a reminder that the ocean's call was eternal and his battle far from over. He looked back once more at the restless sea, its surface shimmering with spectral light. Somewhere beneath those waves, the abyss waited, patient and endless, whispering its dark secrets through the static sea. And Ellis Crane, fractured but unyielding, carried the weight of both memory and madness into the uncertain dawn. The room was a haze of shadows and static, the air thick with the low hum of Ellis radio equipment a constant, gnawing presence that had become both a tether and a torment. He sat hunched over his cluttered desk, fingers trembling as they hovered above the dials and switches, eyes glazed and unfocused. Pale light from the flickering screen washed over his gaunt features, casting long shadows beneath his unkempt dark hair. The soft crackle of static filled the silence, punctuated by faint, elusive whispers that teased the edges of his hearing, never fully clear, never completely comprehensible. Ellis's breath came in shallow gasps as the room seemed to close in around him. His mind wavered between moments of sharp clarity and crushing delirium, a fragile balance disturbed by the voices that refused to fade. They whispered his name, called to him from the depths of the static sea, their tones shifting like waves, sometimes pleading, sometimes accusing, always insistent. He reached out, fingers brushing the knobs, trying to isolate a pattern, a meaning, something tangible amid the chaos. But each adjustment only deepened the distortion. Images flickered behind his eyelids, shadowy figures beneath roiling waves, the face of Lena, his lost sister, smiling, then dissolving into the murky depths. His heart pounded with a dread that was both familiar and alien. A faint knock at the door stirred him from his trance. The door creaked open, and Mara Voss stepped inside, her sharp eyes soft with concern. "Ellis," she said gently, "you need to rest. These voices, they're consuming you." He shook his head, voice hoarse. "I have to understand. They were not just noise. They were real. Lena, she's in there." Mara moved closer, setting a hand on the cluttered table. "The sea holds many secrets, but you can't let them drown you. Remember the stories, the warnings." Ellis stared at her, the room tilting as the static swelled into a cacophony of whispers and moans. "I'm not sure what's real anymore. The voices, the memories, they blur together. Am I losing myself, or is something else reaching through?" Her gaze was steady, but behind it lay a shadow of fear. "We'll face it together, but you must hold on." Later, on the weather-beaten pier, Captain Jonas Reed stood with his back to Ellis, the storm-darkened sea thrashing beneath heavy clouds. The scent of salt and rain filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of seaweed and brine. Jonas's voice was low and rough as he spoke. "You've been listening too close, son, the ocean. It's not just water and waves, it's a wound, a hunger. The voices you hear, they're not all human." Ellis's jaw tightened. "I don't want to be afraid, I need to know the truth." "Truth comes at a price," Jonas warned. "Sometimes it's too high." Back inside his room, Ellis sank to the floor, radio dials spinning erratically in his unsteady hands. The static spiraled into a roaring tempest of sound, voices overlapping, Lena's laughter lingering, the abyssal voices' dark undertones threading through. His vision blurred. The boundaries between signal and nightmare dissolved. He reached out blindly, desperate to grasp something solid. "Ellis." The voice was distant, fragmented, yet unmistakable. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the engulfing tide of sound and shadow, caught in the liminal space between sanity and the abyss. Outside, the storm raged on, the sea's eternal call echoing through the static, promising revelation or oblivion. As the night deepened, the fragments of Ellis's reality shattered further, leaving only the haunting echo of voices from the static sea. The fragile thread that tethered Ellis to the world of the living frayed beneath the weight of the spectral chorus that haunted him. Mara's visits grew more frequent, an anchor of compassion amid the spiraling chaos. She brought books and whispered legends, stories of vanished fishermen, drowned memories, and the sea's unforgiving grasp. Yet even her presence could not fully bridge the widening gulf between Ellis's fractured mind and the tangible world. Captain Reed's warnings echoed in Ellis's ears, the gruff fisherman a somber reminder of the cost borne by those who dared listen too deeply. The sea was not merely a vast expanse of water. It was a repository of loss, rage, and ancient sorrow, a living entity entwined with the human psyche in ways both cruel and incomprehensible. Ellis's nights blurred into days, the static never ceasing, never yielding. His dreams entwined with memories, some his own, others alien, melding faces and voices into a tapestry of dread and longing. The line between hallucination and reality thinned until it vanished, leaving him adrift in a liminal space where the abyssal voice whispered secrets too terrible to fully grasp. In fleeting moments of lucidity, Ellis questioned his own sanity. Was the abyssal voice a spectral manifestation of the ocean's ancient consciousness, or merely the unraveling of a haunted mind? The answer eluded him, a maddening enigma that fueled his obsession and deepened his despair. Yet beneath the torment, a stubborn ember of resolve persisted. Ellis knew that surrender meant dissolution, becoming another lost soul swallowed by the sea's eternal static. He clung to that fragile hope, even as the voices grew louder, their call inescapable. The low hum of the town's fading daylight filtered weakly through the stained windows of Mara Voss's library, casting long, wavering shadows across the rows of ancient books and brittle papers. Ellis Crane sat hunched over the worn oak table, his eyes shadowed, his hands trembling as he traced invisible patterns in the dust. Mara watched him carefully, her sharp eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and professional curiosity. Across from them, a weather-beaten leather satchel lay half open, its contents a jumble of ship logs, faded photographs, and radio equipment schematics spilling out like fragments of a fractured past. "You're not just hearing voices anymore, Ellis," Mara said quietly, breaking the silence. "You've been to the edge and back. What happened beneath the waves?" Ellis swallowed hard, his throat tight with memories that felt less like recollections and more like invasions. "It's hard to explain," he began, voice rough and uncertain. "The abyssal voice, it's not just a sound or signal. It's something alive down there. Something that knows me. It reached into my mind, showed me things, fragments of memories I didn't know I had, or maybe never lived." Mara leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Did it try to take you?" He nodded slowly. "It tried, but it's not all darkness. There's sorrow there too, like a collective grief of lost souls, trapped and twisted beneath the sea. It's both a warning and a plea. I think it wants to reclaim what was taken from it, what was lost. And I can't stop hearing it, not even when I close my eyes." The heavy wooden door creaked open behind them, admitting a gust of salty air and the sharp silhouette of Captain Jonas Reed. His eyes, as piercing and weathered as the ocean itself, scanned the room until they settled on Ellis. "You read digging too deep," the captain said gruffly, his voice rough as the sea winds. "This town's been cursed with the sea's wrath long before you came. Those voices don't just whisper for anyone, they call for the ones they've marked." Ellis met the captain's gaze, a flicker of defiance sparking in his pale eyes. "I have to understand. If I don't, I'll never be free of it." Reed's shoulders sagged slightly. "There's a price to pay, son. That voice, it's ancient and cruel. It doesn't care about your sanity or your life. It only wants to pull you under." Mara stepped between them, her voice steady but firm. "We can help you, Ellis. But you have to promise to listen, to be careful." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant crash of waves and the faint, eerie static that seemed to seep from Ellis's very being. Later that evening, Ellis returned to his workshop, a cramped space cluttered with tangled wires, blinking consoles, and the ever-present radio equipment that had become both his refuge and his prison. The glow of the screens cast ghostly light on his pale face. With trembling hands, he tuned the radio once more, the static filling the room with its endless, whispering noise. From within the white noise, faint voices emerged, fragments of warnings, memories, and pleas. Among them, a voice as clear and fragile as a dying ember called his name, echoing the face of Lena, his lost sister, haunting and distant. The boundaries between past and present blurred until Ellis felt as though he stood on a precipice, suspended between his own reality and the abyssal unknown. Outside, the ocean breathed with a low, ominous rumble, its pulse sensing with the rhythmic crackle of the radio waves. The abyssal voice was still there, waiting, patient and eternal. Ellis closed his eyes, the voices swirling around him like cold currents pulling him deeper. "I'm not afraid," he whispered, though a tremor betrayed his words. "Not yet." But even as he spoke, Mara's words and Captain Reed's warnings echoed through his mind, mingling with the static, the price to pay, the curse beneath the waves. The eternal call that would not be silenced. The night stretched on, endless and heavy with the weight of secrets and sorrow, as Ellis Crane faced the lingering shadows of the past and the uncertain darkness of the future, caught forever in the echoes of the static sea. The workshop was cloaked in a suffocating silence except for the low hum of the radio equipment, its dials flickering intermittently under the dim light. Ellis Crane sat hunched over the console, his gaunt face illuminated by the cold glow of the cathode tubes. The static hissed, a white noise that usually comforted him, a backdrop to the methodical work of decoding signals. But tonight, the static was different. It whispered. Ellis' breath caught when a voice, faint and fragmented, broke through the crackling interference. It was tentative at first, like a fragile thread struggling to emerge from the depths of the ocean. Then, unmistakably, a familiar timbre wove through the noise, a voice he hadn't heard in years, but knew too well. Ellis, his heart pounded violently. The voice was Lena's. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, memories flooding past with relentless force. He was back in the cramped kitchen of their childhood home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on peeling wallpaper. Lena's sharp laughter, the snap of their quarrel over a broken radio, the ache of her absence, it all surged forth in vivid, cruel clarity. The moment shattered as the static surged, swallowing the voice whole. Ellis's eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. The workshop felt suddenly colder, the shadows longer, as if the room itself had become a vessel for the past and the unknown. He reached out, fingers trembling, to adjust the frequency. The voice returned, now clearer, threading through the static with a haunting persistence. "Help me." Was it Lena? Or was it the abyssal voice manipulating the fragments of his memory? Ellis couldn't tell any more. His mind fractured under the weight of uncertainty. Each whisper chipped away at his resolve, blurring the boundary between remembrance and delusion. The next morning brought no relief. Ellis found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror, face gaunt, eyes sunken. The relentless nights had drained him, but the voices, those spectral transmissions, refused to cease. They intertwined with his thoughts, a ceaseless tide pulling him deeper into madness. In a rare moment of clarity, he sought out Felix Harrow, the psychologist who had been trying to help him navigate the labyrinth of his crumbling mind. The office was a stark contrast to Ellis's chaotic world, orderly, quiet, safe. Felix regarded him with measured concern. "Tell me, Ellis, what do you hear?" Ellis hesitated, then spoke haltingly. "Voices." Lena's voice calls from the static. "But it's not just her. It's something else. Something beneath the waves. I can't tell where memory ends and the signal begins." Felix nodded slowly. "It sounds as though your mind is trying to make sense of overwhelming stimuli. The past and present merging, perhaps. But these voices, are they real or hallucinations?" "That's the problem," Ellis whispered. "I don't know anymore." The session was a struggle. Ellis's frustration mounted as he grappled to describe experiences that defied logic. The voices felt tangible, yet elusive. They beckoned him toward something vast and unknowable, a dark presence that seeped into his consciousness. Days blurred into one another. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the coastline and casting Marrow Bay into a twilight realm. Ellis found himself wandering the cliffs at dusk, the wind lashing cold against his skin. The ocean roared below, a living entity breathing secrets in the crashing waves. From the static of his portable radio, the voices rose again, chanting in a cadence both hypnotic and terrifying. They spoke of depths uncharted, of souls lost and found, of an eternal call that no one could resist. Ellis's gaze fixed on the horizon where sea met sky, the boundary dissolving like the fragile line in his mind. The fractured pieces of his identity trembled on the edge of surrender. In the darkest corners of his thoughts, the abyssal voice whispered promises and threats. An ancient consciousness entwined with the memory of Lena and the countless others claimed by the sea. Ellis knew, with a chilling certainty, that his obsession was no longer a mere fascination, it was an inexorable descent. Yet amidst the chaos, a fragile ember of clarity flickered. He whispered to the void, to the static, to the spectral voices that haunted him, "I will find the truth, even if it destroys me." The wind howled in answer, carrying the distant echo of a name, Lena. And the static swallowed it whole, leaving only the unrelenting hiss of the sea's eternal call. As twilight deepened into night, Ellis returned to his workshop, the radio equipment humming softly. He sat down, hands steady despite the storm raging within. He began to record, capturing every whisper, every fragmented plea embedded in the static. Each playback was a descent further into the abyss, but also a step closer to understanding. Outside, the fog thickened, curling tendrils creeping toward the windows like spectral fingers. The voices crescendoed, a symphony of fractured memories and ancient sorrow. Ellis closed his eyes and listened, letting the fractured mind embrace the darkness, poised on the brink of revelation or oblivion. The fractured mind, the voices, the ocean all converged in a moment suspended between reality and nightmare. Ellis Crane, caught between past and present, between obsession and sanity, prepared to face the depths that awaited him beneath the static sea. The static was louder than usual that evening, a dense white noise that filled Ellis Crane's cramped radio room with a relentless, buzzing presence. He sat hunched over his equipment, the glow of dials and meters painting his gaunt face in sickly shades of green and blue. The fog outside pressed close against the windows, muffling the world beyond and leaving only the persistent hum of the sea and the whispering static to fill the silence. For hours Ellis listened. The voices had returned stronger, more insistent, weaving in and out of the static like ghostly threads spun from the ocean's depths. At first, they were only fragments, half-words, broken pleas, the faintest hints of melody rising from the white noise. But tonight, the whispers coalesced into something more coherent, more urgent. He adjusted the dials, trying to isolate the source. The voices, always shifting and warping, seemed to stretch beyond the frequencies his equipment typically monitored. There was a pattern here, a rhythm beneath the chaos. Ellis's fingers danced across the controls, capturing the signals on tape, rewinding and replaying the fractured messages again and again. Ellis. Ellis. The name slipped through the static like a breath, soft and chilling. He froze, heart pounding. It was no longer a distant murmur, but a direct call, a summons from the abyss. His mind raced back to Lena, the ghost in the static, the lost sister whose voice had haunted his memories for years. Was it her? Or the abyssal voice manipulating his grief, locking him tighter in its grip? The next morning, the grey light creeping through the curtains found Ellis exhausted but unable to rest. He met Drew. Felix Harrow in the small consulting room cluttered with books and notes. The psychologist's calm presence was a fragile anchor in Ellis's storm of obsession. "You're rehearing things again," Felix said gently, though the concern in his eyes betrayed his professional detachment. "Not things," Ellis insisted, holding up a battered cassette tape. "Listen to this." Felix pressed play. The room filled with the crackling static, then a faint voice, broken and distant, but unmistakably human. It pleaded, "Come, don't leave, forever." Ellis watched Felix's face carefully. The psychologist's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, only nodding slowly. "This isn't just in my head," Ellis whispered. "There's something else out there. Something reaching through the static." Later that day, Mara Voss arrived with a small trove of weathered books and maritime records. Her sharp eyes scanned the notes Ellis had scribbled feverishly in the margins of his logbooks. "Marrow Bay has always been a place of strange calls," she said, opening a leather-bound tome to an ancient illustration of a sailor clutching a twisted horn that emitted ghostly waves. "Folklore speaks of an eternal call, a voice from the depths that lures men and women to vanish beneath the waves, never to return." Ellis leaned in, the weight of her words sinking into the marrow of his bones. "Do you think it's real?" Mara hesitated. "I don't know. But these voices, your recordings, they echo those stories. The sea has always been a place of mystery and loss." The evening deepened into night, and Ellis returned to his lair of wires and screens. He pressed record again, the microphone picking up the rhythmic crash of the waves outside and the growing chorus of voices from the static. The air grew thick with an electric charge, a current that seemed to pulse from the depths themselves. Voices overlapped, some pleading, others warning, all corrupted by the endless white noise. Then, above the chaos, a single phrase emerged, clear and haunting: "The call is eternal. The sea remembers." Ellis's breath caught in his throat. The abyssal voice was no longer confined beneath the waves. Its reach stretched beyond, a ceaseless lament that defied time and space. He leaned closer to the microphone, whispering back into the void, "I hear you. I'm coming." The static surged around him, and for a moment, the boundary between signal and sea dissolved into a chilling symphony of voices that promised an endless call, one that would never cease, dragging him further into the depths of obsession and despair. Ellis's hands trembled as he switched off the recorder, the room falling silent but for the distant, relentless crashing of the surf. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the coastline in a shroud of grey. And somewhere beneath the waves, the abyssal voice waited, patient and unyielding, its eternal call echoing through the static sea, the dim light of Dre. Felix Harrow's office cast long shadows across the walls, the muted ticking of an ancient clock the only punctuation to the uneasy silence between patient and doctor. Ellis Crane sat rigid in the worn leather chair, fingers clenched tightly in his lap, eyes flickering with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. The room smelled faintly of old books and brewed tea, an attempt at comfort that seemed to fall flat against the storm of thoughts raging inside Ellis's mind. "Ellis, dear." Harrow began carefully, adjusting his glasses as he regarded the younger man before him. "You've been pushing yourself harder than anyone should. The episodes you've described, the voices, the hallucinations, they're worsening. You need help." His voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of genuine concern. Ellis's jaw tightened. "I'm fine, I just need to understand them. The voices, they're not just random noise, they're messages. I can decode them, I have to." His gaze darted around the room, restless, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Dr. Harrow leaned forward. "Ellis, this obsession is dangerous. It's pulling you away from reality. You've isolated yourself, stopped sleeping properly, and every day you drift further from who you were. You're not alone in this, I'm here to help you. But only if you let me." Ellis shook his head slowly, a bitter smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "Help? You think you can help me understand what's beneath the waves? What's calling to me from the static? You don't hear it, Felix. You don't see what I see. This isn't madness, it's truth." The psychologist sighed, pushing a hand through his thinning hair. "Ellis, sometimes the mind tries to protect us by creating stories when it can't face the pain beneath. These voices, they might be your mind's way of coping." Ellis's flashed with a sudden intensity. "No, it's not just my mind, it's real. You don't understand because you don't listen. But I do. Every crackle, every whisper, I'm closer than ever." Later that night, Ellis returned to his cramped workshop, the walls lined with salvaged radio parts, tangled wires, and flickering monitors. The glow of a single desk lamp illuminated his gaunt face, the dark circles under his eyes deepening. His hands moved with frantic precision, rewiring circuits, adjusting frequencies, and recording every fragment of static that hissed through the speakers. The voices were louder tonight, more insistent, threading through the static like a mournful song. Sometimes they called his name, other times they whispered warnings he could almost grasp, but not fully understand. The line between memory and signal blurred, and Ellis found himself slipping, caught in the tangle of sound and meaning. His phone buzzed sharply, breaking the silence. "Rah." Harrow's name flashed on the screen. A call at this hour was unusual. "Ellis." The voice was calm but urgent. "Please, you need to stop this. The longer you stay in that workshop, the deeper you fall. Let me help you before the voices take you completely." Ellis's fingers hovered over the screen, a surge of frustration and despair flooding him. "I can't stop now," he whispered. "Not when I'm so close." The line went dead, leaving Ellis alone with the static's haunting chorus. Days bled into nights, and Ellis's world contracted to the narrow sphere of his obsession. His interactions with Mara and Captain Reed became brief, strained encounters, their concern palpable but unable to breach the barrier he'd built around himself. One evening, drawn by a compulsion he could neither resist nor explain, Ellis found himself standing on the fog-choked shoreline. The sea roared beneath a slate-gray sky, waves crashing with a primal fury. The air was thick with salt and the faint, ever-present hum of static. As he stared out into the restless waters, the whispers rose once more, clearer than before. "Ellis, come," his heart pounded, breath catching in his throat. The call was a siren's song, terrifying, beautiful, and utterly irresistible. "I'm coming," he murmured, stepping forward into the cold embrace of the dark sea, the boundary between signal and reality dissolving with every heartbeat. The edge of madness was no longer a line to fear, it was a gateway, and Ellis Crane was crossing it, drawn irrevocably toward the abyss that awaited beneath the waves. Ellis Crane stood at the edge of Marrow Bay, the fog thick as a curtain drawn tight around the world. The ocean before him was a restless beast, its waves breaking with a rhythm that felt both ancient and alive. The static crackled faintly from the small radio receiver clipped to his belt, but in this moment, it seemed less a device and more a conduit, an otherworldly thread stitching together the tangible world and the shadowy depths beneath the waves. He could hear it again, the voices. Not just the fractured whispers that had haunted his nights for weeks, but now a chorus rising and falling in sync with the sea's pulse. They were no longer distant. They were near, pressing against his mind like water, seeping through cracks in stone. Ellis, the name came fractured and warped but unmistakable, carried on the static like a siren's lament. He closed his eyes, the salt air biting at his skin, and tried to anchor himself. Inside, his radio room was a claustrophobic sanctuary cluttered with coils of wire, circuit boards, and the omnipresent hum of machines. The walls seemed to breathe with the flickering shadows cast by the erratic glow of his equipment. As Ellis twisted dials and adjusted frequencies, spectral figures flickered just beyond the edge of vision, ghostly sailors, drowned memories, and something darker still. The abyssal voice, elusive and terrible, whispered through the interference, weaving his sister Lena's voice into its tapestry of sound. He reached out, desperate to grasp meaning from the chaos, but the lines between past and present, memory and madness blurred. The radio emitted bursts of corrupted signals, voices layered atop one another in a cacophony of sorrow and rage. Lena's laughter, once bright and clear, now twisted into a mournful echo that haunted his thoughts. The room seemed to dissolve around him, walls melting into a watery abyss where shadowy forms danced in a spectral tide. Figures of lost fishermen, their faces obscured by kelp and time, swirled alongside the shifting presence of the abyssal voice. It was as if the sea itself had reached through the static to pull him into its dark narrative, inviting and threatening in equal measure. "Ellis," the voice murmured again, softer now, a poisonous lullaby. He staggered, clutching the wooden desk for support, the boundaries between worlds fraying at the edges of his consciousness. His fingers trembled as he reached for the recorder, capturing fragments of the spectral conversation that no sane mind should hear. The abyss was pulling at him not just through sound, but through memory and spirit. He saw flashes of his childhood, Lena's face smiling beside him, then the cold ocean that had swallowed her whole. The grief and guilt twisted within him, tangled with the alien sorrow of the sea's ancient depths. His breath hitched as the room shifted again. For a moment, he was both here and not here, his body anchored to the dilapidated radio shack. His mind adrift in a liminal space where the sea's unknown stretched endlessly. The abyssal voice coiled around his thoughts, a serpent whispering secrets he was not meant to know. He tried to resist, to hold on to the fragile thread of sanity, but the pull was relentless. Every signal corrupted, every whisper a tendril reaching deeper into his soul. He was no longer simply an observer. He was becoming part of the sea's dark story, a vessel for voices lost to time and tide. "Listen," the voice urged, a command and a plea. "Remember. Become." Ellis's hands clenched the recorder tightly, the static filling the room until it was a living thing, breathing and watching. The abyss was not just beneath the waves, it was within him, a gulf that promised oblivion or transformation. As dawn crept over Marrow Bay, the fog began to lift, but Ellis remained trapped between worlds, caught in the endless, haunting call of the static sea. The question lingered in the chill morning air: could he hold on to himself, or would the abyss claim him utterly? The line between memory and madness thinned, and the voices whispered on, eternal and insistent. The room was swallowed by the low hum of the radio equipment, wires snaking across the floor like veins pulsing with unseen energy. Ellis Crane sat motionless in his chair, the pale blue glow of the receiver casting an eerie light on his gaunt face. Outside, the wind battered the windows of his cramped coastal apartment, carrying with it the relentless murmur of the sea, an eternal, restless presence. For hours, he had been tuning the frequencies, searching for a pattern, a sign, some thread of coherence amid the chaos. The voices, once faint and fragmented whispers, had grown louder, more insistent, but also more corrupted, a cacophony of static and broken syllables, half-formed words, and the occasional chilling clarity of his own name. They called to him, beckoning from the depths beneath the waves, a siren song woven from despair and longing. Ellis' fingers trembled as he adjusted the dials, the crackling static swelling into a surge that filled the cramped room with an almost tangible presence. The abyssal voice was there, somewhere between the frequencies, its spectral tendrils reaching out through the corrupted signals. He felt it coil around his mind, a cold embrace that both terrified and fascinated him. His breath hitched as a familiar voice broke through the noise, a soft, pleading whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. Ellis, it was Lena. Or at least something that wore her voice like a mask, a cruel echo twisted by the depths. Memories of his lost sister flooded his mind, her laughter, her vanished smile, the cold void left in her absence. The sea had claimed her long ago, swallowed her whole, but now her voice was back, fragmented and distorted, refusing to let go. A sudden resolve hardened within him. This was no longer just about understanding the signals or uncovering the truth. It was about connection, about reaching out to the abyss and staking his claim before it consumed him entirely. He grabbed the microphone, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside his mind. "This is Ellis Crane," he began, voice raw but determined. "To whoever or whatever is out there, I hear you. I see you. I am here." The static roared in response, waves of corrupted sound crashing over his words, twisting and distorting them until his voice became one with the alien chorus. Shards of warnings, fragments of memories, and pleas for mercy mingled in the air, an indecipherable symphony of madness and sorrow. Minutes stretched into eternity as Ellis poured everything into the broadcast: his fear, his hope, his desperation. The lines between self and signal blurred, his identity dissolving into the endless static sea. He spoke of the lost souls beneath the waves, of the abyss that hungered for remembrance and release. Then, silence. The receiver hissed softly, the voices retreating into the depths once more. Ellis sat back, exhaustion washing over him like the tide. The room felt impossibly vast and empty, the weight of the unknown pressing down. Had he saved anyone? Warned them? Or was he now just another voice trapped in the static, a whisper lost to the eternal call of the ocean's dark heart? As the first light of dawn filtered through the fogged windows, Ellis's eyes remained fixed on the receiver, the faintest trace of a smile, or was it a grimace, playing on his lips. The final transmission had been sent, a fragile beacon in the vast, unknowable sea. And somewhere beneath the waves, the abyssal voice listened. The morning air was thick with fog as Mara Voss approached Ellis Crane's small radio workshop. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly with the restless breeze that swept in from the sea. Inside, the clutter was overwhelming: tangled wires, half-finished circuits, and stacks of weathered notebooks littered every surface. Mara's eyes scanned the chaos, searching for any clue that might explain Ellis' sudden disappearance. She moved cautiously, her fingers brushing aside a coil of copper wire to reveal a small recorder resting on the edge of a battered worktable. Her breath caught as she pressed play, the device crackling to life with a low hum of static. Then, through the crackle, a voice emerged, fragile, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Mara, listen, the sea is not silent, it waits, it remembers." The message ended abruptly, replaced again by the relentless static that had become a haunting backdrop to Ellis's final days. Mara clutched the recorder tighter, a shiver running down her spine. What had he uncovered? And why had he vanished without a word? Outside, the ocean churned under a slate-grey sky. Captain Jonas Reed stood on the wind-battered cliffs, his gaze fixed on the restless waves. In his weathered hand was a small radio, its speaker emitting faint bursts of static that seemed to ripple with unnatural energy. Then, faintly, the distorted voices returned, whispers carried on the sea breeze, fragments of a language older than memory itself. "They're still out there," the captain muttered, his voice rough with decades of salt and wind, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to listen. Back in town, the news of Ellis' disappearance spread like wildfire. Marrow Bay, already a place steeped in shadow and silence, now seemed swallowed by an oppressive stillness. The fog thickened, blanketing the coastline in a suffocating embrace. The waves crashed with muffled ferocity, as if the sea itself mourned the loss of one of its own. Mara and Captain Reed convened that evening in the dim light of Ellis's workshop, the air heavy with unspoken fear. They gathered around the radio equipment, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the dials and meters. The static was relentless, but then, as if summoned by their desperation, the whispers returned, ghostly voices echoing from the depths, calling out with a sorrow and rage that chilled them to the bone. "Ellis, don't forget." The room grew cold, an unseen presence pressing against their senses. Mara's heart pounded as she exchanged a glance with the captain. They were no longer mere observers. They were entwined in the sea's dark narrative, caught between the fading light of hope and the abyssal shadows that threatened to consume them all. The abyssal voice lingered beneath the waves, its call eternal and inexorable. And somewhere beyond the veil of static and silence, Ellis Crane's fate remained a haunting mystery lost to the silent depths, or forever part of the endless signal that pulsed beneath the surface. As the night deepened, the radio's static seemed to pulse in time with their own racing hearts, a chilling reminder that some voices, once heard, can never be silenced. The air was thick with the salty tang of the sea, heavy fog rolling in like a slow tide, swallowing the jagged coastline of Marrow Bay. Atop the weathered cliffs, Mara Voss and Captain Jonas Reed stood in silence, the old radio set between them crackling with relentless static. Faint voices drifted through the white noise, fragments of names, whispers of warnings, and the haunting echoes of a call that refused to be silenced. Mara's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched a stack of Ellis Crane's notes and recordings. The pages were worn, stained with salt and time, filled with meticulous observations and desperate scribbles that chronicled a descent into obsession and madness. "It's like he's still here," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the ceaseless hiss of static. Or maybe, he never left. Captain Reed's weather-beaten face was stoic, the deep lines etched by years spent battling the unforgiving sea. His piercing eyes scanned the horizon, where the fog blurred the boundary between ocean and sky. "The sea doesn't give up its secrets easily," he said gruffly. "And some calls, some voices, they were meant to stay beneath the waves." They had combed through Ellis's workshop earlier that day, finding remnants of a man consumed by his pursuit of the unknown. The radio equipment still hummed quietly, wires tangled like seaweed, the screens flickering with bursts of static that seemed almost alive. Among the clutter were recordings distorted and fragmented, but unmistakably human. Voices calling out, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding, always laced with a sorrow as deep and endless as the ocean itself. In the dim light of the library, Mara spread out the papers, her eyes scanning the cryptic symbols and notes about signal patterns, the lore of vanished fishermen, and references to the abyssal voice. She recalled the warnings Ellis had shared in his last messages, the frantic urgency in his tone as he spoke of the entity beneath the waves. "It's not just a voice," she whispered, "it's a presence, a storm beneath the static." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the distant roar of crashing waves that seemed to sync with the erratic pulses of the radio. Captain Reed lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his grim expression. "I've seen this before," he said, exhaling smoke that dissolved into the mist. Men drawn to the water, lost to the call. Ellis wasn't the first, and if we were not careful, he won't be the last. The radio clicked and crackled again, a sudden surge of distorted sound that coalesced into a faint whisper. "Ellis, come home." The words hung in the air, fragile and chilling. Mara shivered despite herself, the weight of the unknown pressing down like the fog around them. She glanced at Captain Reed, who nodded solemnly. "The sea's call is eternal," he said, "and so are its voices." As night deepened, the workshop stood empty and silent, bathed in the cold glow of moonlight filtering through cracked windows. The radio, alone amidst the scattered tools and papers, continued its endless broadcast. Static swelled and receded like a tide, carrying with it the ghostly echoes of a man who had vanished beneath the surface, but whose presence lingered in the corrupted signals. Ellis's fate remained a mystery. Had he become one with the abyssal voice, a vessel for the ancient consciousness lurking beneath Marrow Bay? Or had the sea claimed him entirely, leaving behind only distorted whispers as a warning? The ambiguity gnawed at the edges of reason, a haunting testament to the cost of obsession and the unknowable depths of the ocean. Mara and Captain Reed remained on the cliff long after the last light had faded, listening to the eternal static and the faint voices calling out from the dark sea. The horizon dissolved into darkness, a void where signal and silence merged, where memory and madness entwined like the restless waves. The radio's song was unending, a spectral symphony of loss, warning, and the insatiable call of the abyss. And in that endless static, the story of Ellis Crane and the voices from the static sea lingered, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be fully uncovered, and some calls never meant to be answered. As the night deepened, the last flicker of the radio's light pulsed once more, a silent beacon in the vast unknown, echoing into eternity. But in the depths below, where light failed and time frayed, the abyssal voice stirred anew, whispering to those who dared to listen, weaving its corrupted song into the fabric of the sea and the minds of the lost. The static was eternal, and so was the call.